Come to order. And the purpose of this hearing is to examine the current state of conflict in Sudan, including very pervasive reports of atrocities against civilians, and to evaluate U.S. policy options to bring the fighting to an end. And I would ask, before yielding myself time, and then my distinguished ranking member, unanimous consent that Congressman Green from Texas and Congressman Simon from California be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Good afternoon, and I do thank our distinguished witness from the State Department for his flexibility and my ranking member. We do have a series of votes coming up which will take up about an hour and a half or more, so thank you for the flexibility. Last week, I had the honor of attending President Trump's convening of two African leaders to bring an end to the decades of bloodshed and war in eastern Congo. It is through the president's leadership and his distinguished Secretary of State and the tireless efforts of other members of the staff that the leaders were able to sign an historic accord, the Washington Accords for Peace and Prosperity, the gravity of which we hope will result in a lasting and sustainable peace between Rwanda and the DRC. Yes, there already been some setbacks, but it is a well-meaning and I think a well-articulated effort. And again, being at that signing ceremony, I've worked on the DR Congo issue for 3 decades, and I almost couldn't believe that this was happening as it did last week. The president is a man of peace, peace through strength, and I am encouraged by his focus on engagement on Sudan. Sudan is under the darkest clouds, a catastrophe that has for far too long been met with paralysis by the international community. The people of Sudan have been subjected to unbearable pain, suffering, and loss of life, and even slavery for decades. 3 decades ago, in 1996, I chaired a hearing on the scourge of slavery in Sudan and in Mauritania, where we heard testimony that absolutely chilled our souls. I went to Khartoum in August of 2005 and met with President Omar al-Bashir and other government officials to press for an end to the genocide in Darfur. The meeting was necessarily contentious. Bashir denied any wrongdoing or complicity in the Darfur genocide. In 2009, however, Bashir was charged by the ICC with committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And in 2010, he was the first person ever charged for the crime of genocide. After meetings with Bashir and other government officials, my staff director, Greg Simpkins, and I visited 2 refugee camps in Darfur, Kama Camp, and stayed overnight in another, Mukjar, an experience that profoundly motivated me to do more, and others to do more, to end the mass violence. When our helicopter landed at the remote Mukjar camp, thousands of women and children danced and clapped and sang beautiful traditional African songs. The people of Darfur have a remarkable generosity and spirit, and it was awe-inspiring. Just about everyone we spoke with, however, especially the women, told us personal stories of rape, senseless beatings, and massacres by the Janjaweed and the Sudanese militias. Former Trump administration Africa director in the National Security Council, Nicole Widdersheim, who will testify today from Human Rights Watch, lived and worked in Sudan for 7 years, and she was on that trip, and she recounts it briefly in her testimony today to Mukjar. Ambassador Sam Brownback, when he was a senator, along with Congressman Frank Wolf, were the first members of Congress to visit Darfur in June of 2004. Their historic trip, followed by an aggressive advocacy for the vulnerable and the victims, helped galvanize efforts to try to end the violence. So I'm always appreciative, we all are, for what those 2 great leaders did. Former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Tony Perkins, has also led a delegation to Sudan, and in 2020 and today will testify that both the RSF and the SAF have a common enemy in Christians. Christians have been denied food aid and told, unless you leave your Christianity, you will not get any food. I mean, that is just, again, talk about coercion. Ken Isaacs of Samaritan's Purse, who testified at our subcommittee hearing this past May 22nd, will testify, and I quote in pertinent part, "Today, the humanitarian situation in Sudan has deteriorated further." That's just 6 months ago, half a year. It's gotten bad, worse. What's happening in Sudan is a man-made famine, with 21 million people facing acute food insecurity and 6.5 million in or near famine. History is not just repeating itself in Sudan, it is compounding. President Trump has called Sudan the most violent place on earth and the single biggest humanitarian crisis, and said tremendous atrocities are taking place. Today, Sudan is in a state of collapse. We're witnessing a genocide that indeed echoes the horrors of the 2000s, perpetrated by the very same actors who soaked the soil of Darfur with blood for 2 decades. The Catholic bishops, and again, when the faith community speaks out, they do it at great risk. They have been very, very strong in saying, we find ourselves deeply disturbed by the ongoing devastating conflicts and the dishonored peace agreements in both nations. They're talking about South Sudan as well, especially with the worsening situation in 2025. It is alarming that dialogue is no longer seen as a vehicle for harmony, healing, reconciliation, and unity, the prelates write. The bishops called out politicians in Sudan and South Sudan for astonishing lack of respect for human dignity. There will never be peace in Sudan unless there's accountability for the atrocities committed by General al-Burhan and the Sudanese armed forces, and Mohammed Dagalo, known more commonly as Hemedti, of the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. These two have sadly savaged Sudan with impunity. Just last week, over 100 civilians, including at least 63 children, were killed in South Kordofan state when the RSF attached a kindergarten. To compound the horror, the RSF then reportedly attacked the first responders and the ambulances as they rushed wounded children to local hospitals. Since this conflict erupted in April of 2023, estimates suggest as many as 150,000 people have been slaughtered and more than 10 million people have been displaced. These aren't just numbers. Every murdered civilian, each child starved to death, each woman violated is a person whose life has been taken and shattered. I'm deeply disappointed by the previous administration's delays in imposing robust sanctions, which many of us called for, and allowing the fight to spin out of control from its beginning. For too long, we have dithered with Burhan and Hemedti as they cemented their power. It is unconscionable that Burhan was allowed to travel to New York to be received by the UN Secretary General, granting legitimacy to a man with massive amounts of blood on his hands. We must also be clear-eyed about the external factors fueling this fire. On Tuesday, the Department of the Treasury announced sanctions on a Colombian-led transnational network of hundreds of former Colombian military personnel who have traveled to Sudan to fight alongside the RSF since 2024. It is the illicit flow of Sudanese gold smuggled by the RSF through the UAE that is directly funding Hemedti's war machine. We cannot turn a blind eye to the UAE's role in supplying weapons that kill innocent Sudanese civilians. Simultaneously, we see the malign influence of Russia seeking a naval base at Port Sudan, and reports of Iranian drones bolstering the SAF. Sudan has become a playground for foreign powers, while the people serve as collateral damage. Today's hearing is again, like it was 6 months ago, a call for more action and a cessation to these hostilities. External financing and arms flows must stop. The UAE must cease all of its support for the RSF, and Turkey and Iran must halt military assistance to the SAF. Crimes against humanity, particularly by the RSF, including mass rape, ethnic targeting, and systematic looting, must be investigated and the perpetrators held accountable. And the RSF, I would point out, I believe, should be designated as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Jacobs, for her opening comments.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses who are coming today. I'm glad that we're holding the second hearing this year on Sudan to bring attention to the ongoing catastrophe. It's been over 2.5 years since the outbreak of war in Sudan. It is now the largest humanitarian internal displacement and food crisis in the world. Nearly 30 million people, 2/3 of Sudan's population, are in dire need of humanitarian assistance, and over 19 million people are facing acute hunger. Famine, which is entirely man-made, is confirmed in El Fasher and Kadugli. More than 13 million Sudanese have been displaced from their homes since the conflict began, including nearly 4 million people forced to flee across Sudan's borders as refugees. And I've seen this firsthand when I traveled to Chad and met with Sudanese refugees last year. Let's be clear. This is a war of choice. The Rapid Support Forces, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and allied militias have waged this war, committing war crimes and holding the Sudanese people captive for their own selfish interests. SAF continues to indiscriminately bomb civilians, while the RSF inflicts the second genocide in 20 years in Darfur. And their external backers, particularly the UAE with their support to the RSF, in addition to Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia, have turned this war into a regional proxy war by supporting and arming either side, risking further regional destabilization. The crisis has deepened over the past 2 months as the RSF overtook El Fasher, and the world only knew from the satellite images that showed destroyed neighborhoods, blood-soaked grounds, and mass graves. Children have fled El Fasher without their parents, and reports include accounts of widespread slaughter and rape by the RSF. But the real tragedy is that the international community saw this coming, and now experts are predicting the same fate in South Kordofan. So I welcome President Trump's newfound and long overdue attention to this crisis after months of neglect. However, I'm concerned that many of the administration's actions have not only set themselves up to fail, but also worsened the suffering of the Sudanese people. Earlier this year, Secretary Rubio cut millions of dollars in assistance to Sudan as part of President Trump's sham foreign assistance review and illegal dismantling of USAID. For example, USAID was previously supporting the heroic efforts of the Sudanese emergency response rooms to open community kitchens and provide basic meals to Sudanese civilians throughout the country. These kitchens are uniquely situated to assist communities cheaper and faster than traditional NGOs, which is why the Biden administration started funding them. But the Trump administration cut all funding for these kitchens, forcing nearly 80% of all ERR activities to stop and affecting over 1,460 community kitchens operating across Sudan, cutting off vulnerable Sudanese civilians from life-saving food assistance. Today, nearly 250 kitchens remain closed, and 315 kitchens can only provide one meal a day. And that is just one example of the administration's counterproductive actions. The Trump administration shut down the Conflict and Stabilization Operations Bureau, which had critical conflict expertise in Sudan that could have supported the administration's peace efforts. And President Trump has failed to name senior positions to lead Africa policy. Almost a year into the administration, there is no nominated person to be Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs at the State Department. He has not only failed to appoint an NSC Senior Director for Africa, but has actually combined the Africa and Middle East Directorate, and he has so far refused to nominate a special envoy for Sudan that is required by law. I would sincerely like to believe that the president's peace agenda is real and will result in real peace. But it's hard to believe that when he has at every turn gutted our foreign policy institutions and neglected to dedicate the necessary staff and resources to make peace not just possible, but enduring. Meanwhile, the Sudanese people don't have time to wait. We need immediate action to hold external backers of the RSF and SAF accountable for their crimes and lack of commitment to a ceasefire. The UAE, for example, is the main backer of the RSF and has made it possible for its genocide to take place. At this point, we've all seen the widespread and credible reporting detailing the UAE's funneling of weapons to the RSF and their efforts to hide it. But instead of using the U.S.'s significant leverage to pressure the UAE to stop arming the RSF, the Trump administration blew through Ranking Member Meek's congressional hold in May and approved a $1 billion arms sale. And to be clear, this criticism is not specific to this administration. I was also critical of the Biden administration's unwillingness to hold the UAE accountable. I believe that the United States needs to use its significant leverage with the UAE to pressure them to finally end their support to the RSF. That's why I've introduced the Stand Up for Sudan Act that would do just that, and why I've joined with Ranking Member Meeks as a co-lead of the U.S. Engagement in Sudanese Peace Act, which would cut off arms to any country sending weapons to the RSF or the SAF. And there are so many more meaningful actions this administration can take. For example, despite the deteriorating humanitarian situation across the country, the State Department has not yet set up a disaster assistance response team, commonly known as a DART, to address the crisis. I urge the administration to do this immediately. And while I was glad to see new sanctions designations on Colombian mercenaries that are fighting for the RSF, they do not designate any of the Emirati entities that are funding this scheme, including the Global Security Services Group. I urge the administration to name and sanction these entities. If President Trump is serious about the peace agenda in Sudan, he should reverse the damage that has been done to our critical programs and institutions, invest the necessary resources and staffing, and take tangible actions to help end the war in Sudan and secure a sustainable peace agreement that ends military rule, establishes a civilian government, and provides a clear roadmap to democratic elections. The Sudanese people have suffered enough. It's time for the United States and the international community to step up and focus on bringing an end to this war so the Sudanese people can finally rebuild their country. So I look forward to hearing from Deputy Assistant Secretary Spera on the State Department's plan to realize the President's interest in peace in Sudan, and from our expert panel to hear their recommendations. Thank you, Chairman Smith. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, and let me welcome our very distinguished Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, Vincent Spera, before us today. From 2021 to 24, he served as the U.S. Consul General in Johannesburg in South Africa. His other overseas assignments include serving as Acting Deputy Chief of Mission and Political Economic Consular at the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and earlier as a Political Economic and Consular Officer in Mongolia, Canada, and Chad. He has a very distinguished career, and without objection, his full resume will be made a part of the record, but I yield him such time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Ranking Member Jacobs, other members of the committee. Really appreciate the invitation to be with you today to address the horrific conflict in Sudan, which of course is well documented, began in April 2023 and has caused the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And the party's manipulation and obstruction of emergency aid have truly exacerbated the suffering of the Sudanese people. And both, as the chairman and ranking member both commented in their opening statements, this crisis and famine are man-made. Just this fall, the world watched in horror as the paramilitary rapid support forces attacked civilians, as thousands of them fled al-Fashir in North Darfur. And survivors reaching humanitarian hubs have described sexual violence, summary executions, and other unspeakable atrocities. And tens of thousands of missing civilians never reach safety. And sadly, today, the RSF is repeating those tactics in the Court of Defense. From our perspective, there are no good actors in this conflict. The Sudanese Armed Forces, known as the SAF, have also committed atrocities, and the administration unequivocally condemns the atrocities committed by both parties. Members of the RSF and allied militias have committed genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And members of the SAF have also committed war crimes, including in May when the United States announced the government of Sudan used chemical weapons in 2024. As President and Secretary Rubio have both emphasized, the administration is committed to helping end these atrocities in Sudan. We have held bad actors accountable, including by sanctioning both the SAF and RSF leaders and individuals from and supporters of both parties. Since the war began, up to and including the sanctions just mentioned, we've sanctioned over 40 individuals and entities to impose real consequences for fueling the conflict. That includes a September sanctioning of SAF-aligned Islamic actors to limit Islamist influence and curtail Iran's destabilizing influence. And then just 2 days ago, as Ranking Member mentioned, the sanctioning of Colombian entities and individuals that directly supported the RSF's horrific acts. These sanctions send a clear message that the conflict and external support to the warring parties must stop, and that will continue to hold malign actors accountable. Under President Trump's leadership and at his direct instructions, Secretary Rubio and Senior Advisor Mossad Boulos have been spearheading negotiations with the belligerents and regional stakeholders. The President is personally driving this effort as we work with the Quad members of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, as well as other partners, to facilitate a humanitarian truce and end the external financial and military support fueling the violence. We've put forward a strong text for a humanitarian truce and urged the parties to accept it without any preconditions. Also underscored that all parties need to honor their humanitarian commitments, including refraining from attacking civilians and allowing full, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access throughout the country. The United States also remains the leader on humanitarian assistance, but we cannot do it alone. However, under this administration, we have provided more than $405 million in assistance for people in need in Sudan, and that includes life-saving food assistance, nutrition, health services, sanitation, and shelter. But as we sit here now, the onus is on the RSF and SAF to agree to end this war. President Trump recognizes the importance of ending this conflict and that an unstable Sudan threatens regional stability along the critical Red Sea corridor. It also creates a permissive environment for terrorists, adversaries such as Iran, and transnational criminal organizations. As a closing note to my statement, I just note that I first worked in Sudan in the early 2000s as a junior officer in Chad during the height of the Darfur genocide, supporting congressional delegations visiting refugees fleeing across the border. Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, associated with some of the trips you referenced in your opening statement to the region. I later worked in Sudan in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor after the fall of Bashir. In those roles and others, I watched Sudan move away from mass atrocities to the path towards a civilian-led government on a democratic path before that process was senselessly destroyed. And it's very much our hope that with peace and stability, the Sudanese people can return to civilian-led governance in Sudan. And we very much look forward to working with Congress to end the conflict. Thank you very much for the time and look forward to the engagement.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Secretary. Let me ask you, if I could, with the UAE, obviously Hamedi is counting on the support that he gets from them for money, for arms, for all kinds of support. Why can't that be turned off overnight? I mean, it seems to me that we do have a relationship with UAE that's very real and robust. That to me is, you know, if that stops, it will provide an opportunity, and they are part of the Quad, it will provide an opportunity for a cessation of hostilities to occur. And secondly, with regards to the African Union peace and security efforts, what are they doing? You know, AU increasingly was taking on a more robust role during the last crisis in Sudan, in South Sudan. And, you know, the talk was, and it was very real, that more of the peacekeepers need to be not just blue helmets, but people that are, you know, under African Union leadership. And I'm not sure what role, you can tell us, they're playing to just get the warring factions to stop it. And then on the humanitarian access, what are we finding in terms of groups being able to get in safely? We know that convoys of World Food Program and others have been attacked. You know, humanitarian workers are there to do nothing but save and preserve life. And yet they become then the victims as well. And of course, then what they would bring to the victims of this violence never shows up. So as a beginning, some of those thoughts, your thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate those questions. I'll try to take them in order. First, on the external support to the parties, I think just to refer to Secretary Rubio, he's been very clear that we need to do everything we can to bring an end to external support, and that needs to stop. In our view, we've been making the case at the highest levels and working through the Quad and other mechanisms with any and all parties that have influence on the actors to bring an end to that support. And when we talk about external support, that's not just direct support to the parties, but also indirect support through other countries. So that is absolutely a major focus of the Quad, and I think I refer to the September Quad statement where it's very clear that the Quad and its members are committed to bringing an end to that. On the African Union, yes, absolutely, we're in regular contact and engaged with the African Union, both on the need to press the two belligerent parties to bring an end to this conflict. Our efforts right now, again, referring to the Quad statement, we're focused on a roadmap to peace, starting with the humanitarian truce to allow for the delivery of more humanitarian assistance, which would create the conditions for political dialogue and ultimately a civilian-led process. Right now, our strong emphasis is that the parties need to accept that humanitarian truce as the first step along that roadmap. And the African Union, we're working in close contact with them to exert any and all pressure on both the SAF and the RSF to agree to that truce to allow this process to move forward and bring an end to the conflict. We also are working very closely with the African Union and other partners about creating the conditions for civilian-led dialogue. There's a wide range of civilian groups that are committed to a future peaceful, prosperous Sudan, and the African Union has an outsized role to play in bringing coordination and cohesion to that efforts to help integrate a future civilian-led government into the broader African Union community. On your question on humanitarian assistance, you absolutely agree with you. The conditions on the ground are extremely difficult and challenging, not just for civilians, but as you note, the humanitarian workers themselves. We're pressing all the parties on the critical role of protecting workers, but there are some avenues of support getting in. We've pressed the parties to keep the Adre border crossing opening on Chad. That's open through the end of the year. Of course, that needs to remain open for longer. Some supplies are getting into Tawila to the west of El Fasher. So some assistance is getting in, but there are many, many obstructions that we're pressing the parties to overcome so that assistance can get where it's needed.
Now, has there been an analysis of what, say the humanitarian corridors were to open up tomorrow, as to how much would be needed, whether or not there's an availability of food and medicine and the like, to quickly be deployed to people who are in many cases, the point of death?
Yeah, thank you. I'd have to get back to you on any specifics on pipeline or readiness, but at the moment, our real focus is on the protection issues and opening up that access due to these man-made bureaucratic obstacles that are preventing the delivery of assistance.
How helpful has been the United Nations in this process, particularly, WFP and some of the other, that's, to me, is one of the best organizations on the planet.
Absolutely, especially OCHA. We're in constant contact with OCHA. Tom Fletcher, the undersecretary, the OCHA, the resident coordinator on the ground, to make sure that any diplomatic pressure we're applying on the countries reflects the challenges that the UN agencies and other humanitarian implementers are experiencing on the ground.
Okay, I see I'm out of time, but I would just ask one final question and then yield to my colleague. Is this something where the president could pick up the phone and talk to the UAE and say, just stop it?
As I said, Mr. Chairman, the external, the role of all the partners in this effort is a major emphasis, and we're exerting all the pressure we can, including through the Quad and other mechanisms.
Because I know we have very little influence on Iran and their support for the government, forces, but it seems that we would have a disproportionate ability there to effectuate change.
We're very focused on that, as the Secretary said. Thank you.
Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually want to follow up on the chairman's questions about external actors, in particular UAE. We've seen over the past 2.5 years many credible reports by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the State Department-funded Sudan Conflict Observatory, France 24, Reuters, Amnesty International, and the UN panel of experts, and our own intelligence, that the UAE is sending weapons to the RSF and continues to do so. I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record one of the most recent reports, a Wall Street Journal article, How UAE Arms Bolstered a Sudanese Militia Accused of Genocide. Thank you. So, Spera, I guess I wanted to follow up because you said just now in response to the chairman that the Quad and its members are all committed to bringing the war to an end. But do you agree that the UAE continues to provide material support to the RSF?
Thank you, Ranking Member Jacobs. I would, again, refer back to the Secretary's comments on the critical role of ending external support and our continued efforts to work with all actors on that front.
Okay, and what is the department doing to utilize its significant leverage in the form of arms sales, including a $1.4 billion sale of helicopter and F-16 fighter jet parts that President Trump circumvented Congress on to push the UAE to stop its support and hopefully prevent another mass atrocity?
Yeah, thank you. As far as broader arms sales issues and those relationships, I'd have to refer to my colleagues either on our Political Military Bureau or our Near Eastern Affairs Bureau. It's not something that I'm directly involved in.
Okay. I will follow up. Which brings me to the broader point, which is it's unclear to me who's actually driving the policy on Sudan. And, I'm glad that the president has newfound interest But I am worried that having no assistant secretary, no senior director for Africa at the NSC, no special envoy despite a legal requirement, no USAID, no Conflict and Stabilizations Bureau, and, you know, I'm concerned that this administration lacks the adequate staff and attention to actually address this conflict. So could you clarify today who within the administration is the lead on Sudan policy?
Thank you, Ranking Member. You know, from my perspective in the Africa Bureau, we have extensive amount of attention to the Sudan crisis from the Secretary on down. We have obviously direct.
So who within the State Department is the lead on Sudan policy?
Well, our Africa Bureau Senior Advisor Boulos, and we're getting all of our direction from Secretary Rubio.
Okay. I would argue that the crisis in Sudan is the largest on earth. I'm not sure that, you know, a senior bureau official with no confirmed assistant secretary is the right level. And while I appreciate what Special Advisor Boulos is doing, he is also in charge of the DRC crisis as well as Arab affairs. He is not Senate confirmed. I'm not sure he has the time or credibility to take this on. I would appreciate him appearing in front of our committee so that we could actually ask him these questions if he is in fact in charge. You said you feel like you have adequate staffing. How many people in the State Department currently work full-time on Sudan?
I would have to get back to you with an exact number, but our reorganization, actually, let me refer back, Ambassador Pratt, our senior bureau official, was before this committee just a few weeks ago, and I think as he noted, after the reorg of this past summer, the Africa Bureau is actually larger than it was at the beginning of the administration, and that includes a reorganization of our East Africa team. So the team that I oversee that works on Sudan is actually larger now than it was at the onset of the administration. It's part of our broader Office of East African Affairs. The exact numbers, I don't have that with you today. I would also say, back to your comments earlier about Senior Advisor Boulos and Secretary Rubio, the relationships that they have forged and we have forged across the interagency really do reflect a whole of government effort, and the clear direction from the White House and the 7th floor of the State Department are really rallying a lot of that support to ensure that we're dedicating all of our attention to the Sudan crisis.
Great, then I will look forward to having Senior Advisor Boulos in front of this committee so we can ask him our questions. Lastly, what is the State Department's plan to respond to the President's interest in finding peace in Sudan?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, what's your concrete plan to respond to the President's interest in finding peace in Sudan?
Yeah, so there's a twofold answer to that. So the overall process, the overall plan is as outlined in the Quad Statement, which I referenced before. The immediate effort is to press the parties to agree to this humanitarian truce for 90 days. That would allow the delivery of humanitarian assistance and provide the space for a political dialogue to lead to this broader transition period and ultimately a stable civilian-led process over the long term. So that's the overall architecture of the approach. Within the department, we do that in really 3 different pillars to our approach. There's direct engagement with the belligerents to press them on all of these fronts on the humanitarian truce, as well as having that dialogue on the way forward. There's engagement with any and all parties that have influence on those actors. Yes, the Quad, but also others, including, as referenced earlier, the UAE, European countries, other countries, and neighboring countries are critical to this effort. And then third is the longer-term effort to bring some cohesion and coordination to the civilian-led effort. So there's the broad path to peace, undergirded by our 3-pronged approach with the belligerents, with external influencers, and to create the conditions for a civilian process. So those two nest together.
Thank you. You know, I'm concerned that despite that announcement being made on September 12th, it's been nearly 3 months and we have no humanitarian truce. So I appreciate all the work you all are doing, but I think it's clear we need to be doing more to stop this bloodshed. Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Olszewski.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith. Thanks to our ranking member, Jacobs. Thanks to all of our witnesses who will be providing testimony today. Mr. Spera, I want to thank you for your many years of service to government here in our country, and I look forward to working with you on this critical issue. I come at this work as a father and someone who has spent my career fighting for kids. And so for me, what is happening to Sudan's children is unconscionable, and it deserves our full attention. We know the images speak for themselves. Starving, and displaced, and traumatized children, makeshift hospitals overflowing with the sick and the injured, classrooms reduced to rubble. Every parent understands the fear of being unable to protect your child. For families in Sudan, this is now, unfortunately, their daily reality. Even places that should offer refuge, like schools and hospitals, have turned into battlegrounds. A recent drone strike on a kindergarten in South Kordofan that killed dozens of children, a drone strike on a school in Kumo that killed school students, and the evidence of mass killings at a children's hospital in El Fashour are just a few of many examples of how children are being explicitly targeted. These attacks are unconscionable. Sudan now represents the world's largest children's crisis. More than 15 million children in Sudan need life-saving assistance. Nearly 4 million children under the age of 5, 4 million children under the age of 5 are experiencing acute malnutrition. More than 6 million children have been forcibly displaced due to the conflict, the world's largest displacement crisis for children. And as we have saw, schools have been turned into shelters or battlegrounds. 90% of school-aged children have no access to formal education, representing the largest education crisis in the world. Girls are especially at risk of sexual violence and trafficking, and young Sudanese boys are being abducted into armed groups and forced into the fight. None of this is inevitable. It is a result of choices made by parties to this conflict and those who enable them. Children are being starved by blocked aid, put in harm's way by attacks on civilian infrastructure, and ignored when negotiations treat their protection as an afterthought. Changing the course for Sudan's children will require focused, deliberate action. So I was here to ask a few questions about the State Department's work specifically on that front. First, given the scale of violence against children in Sudan, how is the State Department prioritizing the protection of children in its diplomatic and humanitarian efforts? And I'm specifically interested in what concrete steps the State Department is taking to ensure that child protection is a central pillar of the U.S. response across Sudan.
Thank you, Congressman. Really appreciate that question and your focus on the issue. This entire issue of civilian protection really is at the core of what's been discussed so far in this hearing, that this crisis is man-made and that this has been the deliberate obstruction and choices made by both the SAF and the RSF, not just to block or prevent the delivery of aid, but also take actions that are harming civilians, including children and others. So our constant focus in our engagements with them and our engagements with all other partners is on the importance of protecting humanitarian workers, protecting civilians, and really choosing to let assistance in and ensure that the people of Sudan are put first, which sadly has not been the case on either side.
Appreciate that. Also wanted to just ask you briefly in my remaining time about unaccompanied children, many of whom who have been arriving in Tooele following the assaults and the attacks that we've seen. Can you talk to me about how the State Department is currently supporting or planning to support children through enhanced protection and a sufficiently scaled up response to address these unique humanitarian needs?
Thank you, Congressman. As I mentioned in my previous answer, we're in constant contact with humanitarian assistance providers, the UN assistance agencies, as well as direct humanitarian assistance providers, to ensure that we have an understanding both of the level of need that we can provide as well as other partners can provide, but also the conditions that are preventing them from delivering the necessary assistance. And so that's absolutely part of our ongoing efforts. I'd have to refer you back to our assistance experts or to those organizations for specific actions, but there's that constant dialogue to ensure that our support is calibrated with the need on the ground.
I appreciate that. I look forward to working with you. I again want to thank our chairman and ranking member for holding this hearing and lifting up these really important issues. If our country is going to have any sort of moral standing in the world, I think it's critical that the United States play an important role here in the violence, but more importantly, in the fallout that so many innocent individuals are experiencing. I thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Okay. Chair recognizes Mr. Meeks. Oh. Okay. Chair recognizes Ms. Sherfilis. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member, for having this, this important hearing today, and thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary, for being here. Over just the past week, we've seen more than 100 children killed in school and attacks targeting South Sudan's economic life. Further evidence of the accelerating atrocities in Sudan. President Trump has repeatedly stated that ending this conflict is essential, not only to halting bloodshed, but to safeguarding the U.S. national security as an unstable Sudan threatens the Red Sea corridor, creates space for terrorist networks, and open doors for malign actors such as Iran, and disrupts regional economic and humanitarian system. Given the resolving this crisis will require a combined effort, enforcing ceasefire, large-scale humanitarian relief, and support for civil society. What specific steps has the Trump administration currently taking for these first two components? Now, you've answered this question a few times, so I'm going to cut to the chase. I think we all have the same concern when it comes to children and actually the strategy behind it. But I guess the biggest concern that we also have is that the FY26 was supposed to be cut, the funding for humanitarian aid. Has that been reconsidered? And if it has been reconsidered, what does that actually look like right now?
Thank you, Representative. Certainly appreciate the interest in and focus on humanitarian assistance. I think when we look at the humanitarian crisis, looking at this year alone, as I said, we remain the #1 provider, the top bilateral donor to the crisis in Sudan at some $405 million this year. And yes, there are huge needs in Sudan. I don't mean to understate that at all, but the central part of the challenge right now are access issues and obstruction issues on part of both parties. And so, yes, there are discussions to be had and will continue to be had in engagement with Congress on levels and the way forward. But so much of our attention right now is on this truce, but then more broadly, pressing the parties on letting the assistance in, protecting workers and protecting civilians, because the man-made element of this is just as important as the levels of aid that are being provided.
So we would love to support those efforts because this is such a huge issue, but without us knowing the funding amounts and what you need to actually make this successful, it makes it difficult for us to have supporting legislation. So as you come to that place where you're looking at funding levels, and we hope you're reconsidering them, we would love to hear more so we can support it, because I think ending this atrocity is our #1 priority because it's been going on for too long. And in addition, do you think, or do you have any recommendations as of right now, how we can support this effort?
In what context? I mean, bringing it, let me just say, a hearing like this is, I think, very important. We have done a lot on our end to elevate the level of attention, including the president speaking out on this just a few weeks ago. We have been, through our role in the UN Security Council, working with other council members to bring attention through nearly bi-weekly council sessions or statements on the crisis. And in hearings like this and other calls and pressure on the parties to choose to bring an end to the conflict, I think are critical. So more eyes and more voices are needed to call attention to this and show the parties that the way forward is through the roadmap that we've outlined through the Quad Statement.
Well, thank you so much, and we hope that we can give more attention to the humanitarian crisis, and we can allocate as many funds that are actually necessary. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Jacobs, for holding this very important hearing today. And I want to thank our witness here, First Deputy Assistant Secretary Spera, and for those who are on the second panel, we appreciate your work and your advocacy. And I think that the attention that this hearing, I would hope, the press was in here and everyone else was covering it, because the largest humanitarian crises in the world is taking place right now in Sudan. The Rapid Support Forces, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and various allied militias are responsible for inflicting heinous violence on the Sudanese people. They have destroyed a nation's hopes for the future, and they are in pursuit of corrupt wealth and power. The United States has a long history of supporting the Sudanese people. And I recall when Omar al-Bashar's regime enabled genocide in Darfur 2 decades ago, We had more of outrage, more noise. Thousands of Americans rallied on the National Mall here in Washington, D.C. Celebrities highlighted the injustices at every turn. And Congress passed actual legislation to increase sanctions, support human rights, and bolster peacekeeping. I don't see that urgency today. And I believe we cannot allow this to be a forgotten conflict. In fact, I can recall myself and a number of members of Congress going to Darfur and confronting al-Bashir directly. We cannot allow and cannot be numb to mass displacement, mass starvation, and mass graves. I think it's past time for Congress and for the administration to take action collectively. This means not only pressing the RSF and SAF to agree to ceasefire and negotiations, but also enforcing real consequences for external actors, all of them, who continue to fuel the conflict by providing arms or money or mercenaries. And without these external resources, both sides would be unable to continue killing civilians and committing mass atrocities in their push to take total control of Sudan. Let me be clear. This brutal war could end tomorrow if the parties fueling this conflict ended their support. And there's a number of them that are doing it. And I'm talking about all the parties need to be held accountable. And the pressure that the United States and our partners should be applying right now. Instead of, what I see, and I don't know the active involvement in how we are pushing the Quad with diplomats, not just cutting deals and trying to see, where we get some resources or some minerals or something of that nature, and not trying to just get a title to try to get an award or something of that nature. I'm talking about being ready to pick up the phone and make a real impact and talk to all of the members of the Quad and get them together. For example, one of the things that I wanted to ask you and to talk about was the United States, what they could do right now to help bolster a responsible regional approach to end the fighting in Sudan is to make this a priority engagement with other African leaders. A great opportunity to do that would have been during the U.S. African Leaders Summit, the ALS, which unfortunately what happened, President Trump was required to have the ALS by law to convene it this year. It's now December 11th, and there's no ALS has been held. When members of this committee wrote to Secretary Rubio about this, we received a response that noted the importance of the ALS, but contained no commitment to the summit, either this year or even next year. So I'm just asking you, will you commit today that the United States will hold the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit next year so that we can have a direct and get the African leaders involved, along with compelling and talking to those of the Quad to really get something done?
Thank you, Representative Meeks. Really appreciate your comments, especially on the need to bring more attention to the crisis that's happening in Sudan, and would just underscore that with the President's amplification of the U.S. interest and the Secretary's direct engagement, that's exactly what we're trying to do, and look forward to continuing to work with Congress and others to bring more attention. On the Africa Leaders Summit, I'm not able to sit here today and announce that we have a date or time, but we're constantly working with the White House and across the administration to look at options for high-level engagement. I would point to the fact that there have been a wide range of high-level engagements, including at the presidential level in Africa. As was referenced in the opening statements, we had the peace signing just last week between DRC and Rwanda. Those two presidents were also at the White House back in June. We've had engagements throughout the year, including in July when the president hosted African leaders at the White House. So we are continuing to maintain that high level of engagement with senior leaders at the across the African continent on these issues of critical importance. Yes, on the security front, on issues like Sudan, on issues like the conflict in the Congo, but also on our broader prosperity agenda, really looking at efforts to bolster our development agenda through a commercial lens that brings prosperity both to Africa and to the United States.
Well, look, and it's got to be more about the American people. Let me just ask this, because I know the Quad countries, for example, are pushing the RSF and the SAF to agree to a 3-month humanitarian ceasefire and want to build toward a lengthier and more sustainable ceasefire after that. But so far, the RSF has agreed in theory to a humanitarian ceasefire, but clearly that's not serious because the militia has continued to launch brutal attacks on civilians in Darfur and in the Kordofan region, and the ASF has rebuffed the humanitarian ceasefire altogether. Now, I just want to find out what's the U.S.'s approach to this, to gathering and making sure that these ceasefires hold, and how are they working with the Quad? In fact, can you tell us, in achieving peace in Sudan, how has it changed, if it has, since President Trump announced that Sudan would become a priority, if it is a priority?
Thank you, Representative. Completely agree. The onus is on the parties to take action, and the words have been empty. The RSF announcing agreement to a humanitarian truce, exactly as you say, they have not lived up to that statement, especially with the attacks going on in Kordofan, and then the SAF not agreeing to the truce to begin with. I think what is different and what we have tried to emphasize is that this truce is the first step in a longer-term plan to lead to a peaceful civilian-led Sudan. So this truce is meant to be short-term in nature, to give the space for that political discussion on a transition to happen, while at the same time starting already our efforts to bring the civilian dialogue into a more cohesive structure, so that when that time comes, there is something to transition to. So this is all happening simultaneously, but the first step is that truce, and our efforts are really focused on pressing the parties and anyone with influence on them, Quad members or not, to press them to accept this critical first step to end this man-made crisis.
I just want to make sure, and I'm ready to step and work with the administration if we're going to put pressure and work with and put pressure on those that are part of the Quad, whether it's the Egypt or the UAE or Saudi Arabia and us. That's how I think the difference will really happen here. And I've had conversations when various heads of states, both from Saudi Arabia, as well as from the UAE, as well as from Egypt. I'm talking to them and try to pressure them. I would hope that we can work together to make this happen and again, get all of the external parties stopping from giving weapons to the various groups and militias, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to save and help the Sudanese people. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Before yielding, Ms. Rattlewagon, there is a UN arms embargo. It was just renewed. Hopefully the UN and all of us are trying to enforce that. And I would ask you, I introduced HRES 479 in June, calling for a special envoy, and we all know there would have never been a peace that's now been shattered in Sudan without Senator Danforth, and ditto for Northern Ireland. That happened because of a special envoy as well. So I hope that that's something that would be, done and done soon. Maybe Sam Brownback could do it. I mean, nobody knows this like he does, but we do need someone walking that point. But before you go, I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's see. What concrete and verifiable actions has the government of Sudan taken to fulfill its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and how is the department assessing the government of Sudan's compliance following credible reports of chemical weapon use?
Yeah, thank you. The chemical weapons issue is obviously very serious, given our finding in our announcement that the government of Sudan did use chemical weapons, and we immediately imposed sanctions after that. We've been very clear to the authorities that they need to acknowledge that those violations took place, commit to ceasing to use chemical weapons, and fully cooperate with the Organization for the Prohibition Against Chemical Weapons. We're hoping to see that genuine leadership. It's a press we've made, and we've made very clear that if they don't take those concrete steps, that additional consequences will be imposed. But the call remains on the authorities to take the steps they need to take, and unfortunately, we have not seen them take those steps yet.
There are differing reports that the SAF has offered Russia a Red Sea naval base capable of hosting up to 300 Russian personnel and multiple warships. What is the status of that agreement? How would a formalized Russian military presence at Port Sudan alter the U.S. position in East Africa? And what are the potential implications for countries in the region this base becomes a reality, if this base becomes a reality?
Yeah, thank you. We're certainly aware of those reports, something that we're very focused on. We've made very clear to the parties that any action with those Russian authorities or entities could trigger real consequences. I think through our more than 40 sanctions over the course of the conflict have made clear we are willing and prepared to take action, and we've made clear that there would be consequences for actions such as that run counter to our interest, or more broadly, run counter to the interest of peace and stability across Sudan and the Horn of Africa as a whole.
How else are countries like Russia, China, or Iran using the conflict in Sudan to their benefit or to the detriment of the United States?
From our perspective, Congresswoman, our focus is on pressing the parties to accept this truce and to agree on a path forward. Any efforts to work with the parties that are not in furtherance of that goal run counter to peace and prosperity. So that's where our emphasis really needs to lie. So when we talk about Islamist influence, Iranian influence, other influence of bad actors, that's what we want to steer away from and get on this path that we've laid out. That's the path that's in front of us, and that's what we're pressing on with all of our tools, especially at the diplomatic level.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Again, if you could respond on the special envoy, if that's very seriously being looked at, to name someone. And secondly, obviously Ambassador Waltz, former Green Beret, was deployed to Nigeria at one point in trying to mitigate the horrific actions by Boko Haram. He gets it, and he's at the UN. There is an arms embargo. Is there a plan there as well to push this very aggressively?
So I'm sorry about the second question.
Second has to do with Ambassador Waltz. What role are we playing at the UN to try to really get all parties to stop this senseless killing?
Okay, thank you. On Sudan specifically?
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understood the question. So
I just
yeah.
mentioned that he had been deployed to Nigeria and as part of an effort to stop Boko Haram when he was in the military. So he really understands, I think, Africa. He was on this committee, as you know. So
Yeah. No, thank you. On the envoy question, I'll just say that's not a role that I'm specifically involved in my position. It would really have to, certainly aware of the legislation and that language, but I would have to refer you either to our Office of Presidential Appointments or other leadership in the department. I'm not involved in
if
the
you could convey to
selection
them that
process.
there
We'll
is a
certainly
great
convey that,
interest of
Chairman.
you.
I
Ms.
absolutely
Jacobs
understand.
is a co-sponsor of our
I mean, I would reiterate, though, that with the Secretary's involvement and Senior Advisor Boulos, we're getting very clear direction and guidance on the way forward, and really has the department focused on this, but absolutely will relay that.
Thank you.
As far as the UN and Ambassador Waltz, a very close relationship with our team up in New York. Our leadership, including myself, briefed him before he took on that position, and we've really relied on his leadership in New York to ensure that Sudan remains very prominent on the Security Council's agenda through regular meetings, briefings, statements, and elsewhere. So there's a very, very close coordination between our teams.
Ms. Jacobs, and then we'll. Okay.
This microphone's not my friend today. Spera, in the days before al-Fashir fell to the RSF, the State Department reportedly hosted indirect talks in Washington among the Quad members and representatives of the SAF and the RSF. Can you tell this committee what the contours of those talks were, and specifically, how did the United States engage with the RSF on its apparent concurrent efforts to overrun al-Fashir while its representatives were in Washington?
Thank you, Representative Jacobs. As far as specifics of the diplomatic engagement, I mean, I can't really get into details, but we, as part of the strategy I outlined earlier, it's critical that we remain in direct contact with all the
I understand that, but knowing what had happened as a result of RSF attacks on the Zamzam displaced persons camp and previously in the city of El Geneina, were there any consequences discussed for the potential fall of al-Fashir while you were meeting with RSF representatives?
We've been in direct contact with, we've been in contact with all the parties throughout, and absolutely pressing on the need to avoid the humanitarian crisis in al-Fashir.
So why have there
before
been
and
no
after.
apparent consequences for the RSF in the aftermath of their attack on the city, given the horrific reports that have emerged?
And al-Fashir specifically, I mean, I would point to the sanctions on the Colombian mercenaries just 2 days ago, but we've taken direct action against the RSF. Its leader is sanctioned. Other members of the RSF have been sanctioned. We've imposed a wide range of consequences throughout the conflict.
And on that note, General Hamedi's younger brother, Al-Goni, was here for those talks. However, I believe he has been designated for sanctions, and he reportedly stayed at the Waldorf Hotel here in D.C. Did the administration grant any special licenses to enable his stay?
As far as licenses, I'm not sure what that would refer to. I mean, we engage with all the parties.
Well, sanctioned individuals usually are not allowed to stay in the United States at very nice hotels.
I mean, I can't speak to the financing or support of his trip. It's not something that we paid for or would have funded or supported directly through financial means. Our effort includes engaging with any and all actors that have an influence on the conflict, including members from from all belligerents to the conflict. And so that's a central part of our effort, is placing that direct pressure on those in positions of authority and influence.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much, Mr. Secretary, and we look forward to any additional responses you might want to provide, and let's work together on trying to stop this bloodshed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Really appreciate the attention to this and the opportunity to work with you.
Thank you. No, there's no vote yet. We know that Ambassador Sam Brownback does have to, he has an engagement and he can't miss it. So I'd like to invite him to the witness table to present his testimony. And then we will break for votes and come back about 3 o'clock. And I apologize to our other witnesses in advance for that. But Sam, if you would mind taking the witness table. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony and leadership. I can't have everybody there, can I? But
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for accommodating me on this and on the flight that I have.
well, we got 1 minute, Ambassador, but if the others could come to the table, and I will introduce them all maybe a little bit later. I just don't want to, no problem. Okay, let me just introduce Sam Brownback, because the vote has not been called yet, and we have 15 minutes once it is. Sam Brownback served as Ambassador at Large for the International Religious Freedom from February of 2018 to January of 2021. He was also governor of Kansas from 2011 to 2018. Prior to that, he represented his home state in the United States Senate, as well as the House of Representatives. He has had every important job you could possibly imagine. While a member of the Senate, he worked actively on the issue of religious freedom in multiple countries, and I said in my opening comments, he was the first to go to Darfur and to raise the ugly specter of what was happening there, and he helped wake up not just the country, but the world, and I thank him for that. Prior to his public service, Ambassador Brownback practiced law and taught ag law at Kansas State University. He got his BS from Kansas State University and JD from the University of Kansas. He is currently serving as co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Summit and chairman of the National Committee on Religious Freedom. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to be in front of you. I think you're the most accomplished legislator in the history of the United States. I don't know of anybody that's gotten more bills passed than Chris Smith has. I want to measure that someday and see. And I don't just say that, I say that with great admiration and respect, because they've generally been in this field of taking care of people that are in difficult circumstances. I want to submit my testimony for the record, and I would just like to really speak directly to the members here. This is one of these unusual crises that's actually solvable, and that actually I think each of us can play a role at. When I saw the end of the meeting and the report coming out from when the Saudi Crown Prince was meeting with the president, and the Saudi Crown Prince makes this request to President Trump to end the conflict in Sudan. At first I thought, that's a really kind of an odd request. It seemed like I was struck by why that request, but then I thought, this is one of the phenomenal opportunities we actually have to get at one of these crises that generally just go on for years and years, and this one has, and this was a second round in Darfur again, and Frank Wolf and I had gone in and seen this, and you had seen it, and you're just going, not again. But what we have to do then, and I would say both to you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Jacobs, is if you could get behind the effort now and say, we applaud this effort. And Representative Jacobs, if I was in your spot, I'd be saying the same thing you're saying. So I understand what you're saying, and I have no qualms with it, but we actually have a moment here that you could press the president, the head of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, other players in this, and just say, we have disagreements, but on this, we are all together on ending this conflict. We call on the two warring generals to step together and to end this, and the outside parties to do this, and President Trump to host a meeting in the White House of these warring generals to sign the peace treaty. They've got it outlined. They've got it figured out what it needs to be, and we could get back to a Sudan that we had under the civilian government that had actually thrown out blasphemy and apostasy laws. No other Muslim country in the world has ever done that, and they had done that. And there was this optimism with that civilian government, so we know there's a track here. We know there's a will here. We also know that President Bashir had the radical Muslim elements in that country that hosted Osama bin Laden, so those elements are still there in that country. You got to fight and push back against them, but I would call on the two of you to do an editorial together calling on President Trump to host this meeting in the White House, because if we can, as voices, get behind this effort, and the president's got a great motivation in that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said, I'm going to put $1 trillion into the U.S. economy. And China is courting Saudi Arabia so aggressively to move to buy their oil in Chinese currency rather than in dollars, to move off of the dollar as the world currency. So we've got we personally have a lot at stake to show Saudi Arabia that we're working at this, and we can get it done. I just actually would plead with the two of you to be bipartisan, pushing this, not taking away the criticism you have of other things, because the factual basis is there, but saying, here's a moment. I remember when I got together with a congressman from New Jersey, Don Payne, and we carried that original Darfur resolution, and to get that designated as a genocide, first time it had ever been done, while there was a genocide proceeding. It was going on at that time. And he and I got together on that and got it through. And Secretary Powell signed on, declared it a genocide, and I think it was helpful in ending that. I actually think you guys have a pretty interesting role you could play right now of saying, we disagree on a lot of things. We really agree with the president hosting these two warring generals and signing the agreement that we know what can be done, and doing it now, because you do have, everybody knows the numbers on this. We actually have a path. We actually have a path on this one. And I've got more in my testimony, but that's really the point I wanted to make to the two of you. This one's actually this one's actually doable and solvable.
Ambassador Brownback, thank you so very much for your leadership, your vision, the fact that we are at an inflection point, a crossroads. If we grab it with both hands and work across the aisle, as you suggest. And you know, at that point, when you were talking about Darfur, I was Don Payne's ranking member. So it's gone back and forth, but you really led so effectively then and now. So it's a great idea. We need to seize the moment, because otherwise things deteriorate, and we will have a situation where more people are killed, more women are abused and killed, and the hunger issue just goes even worse than it is today. And again, Ken Isaacs in his testimony, like I said earlier, said from 6 months ago, it's gotten actually worse. I mean, that's a short period of time for this to metastasize the way it has. And I think your idea of hosting, or the president hosting the two belligerents and trying to get them to just put down the arms and stop it. And so thank you, Sam, really, Mr. Ambassador, for that suggestion, for your leadership, which has been across multiple decades. And thank you. I'd like to yield to Ms.
I'm good.
Okay. We'll follow up on that, and we're only rushed a little bit because the vote has been called, but we'll come right back, and I again apologize to our other distinguished witnesses. We will be in recess for to about 3 o'clock, 3:10 or so, and then we'll reconvene. But again, Ambassador Brownback,
Thank you.
you're amazing. committee will come to order, and again, I apologize to our very distinguished witnesses and guests for the delay because of the votes. But we did have a good first session, and now we have a tremendous panel to provide insights to the subcommittee. We will begin with Mr. Tony Perkins, the president of the Family Research Council and the former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Mr. Perkins currently serves as the president of the Family Research Council, or FRC, whose mission is to serve in the kingdom of God by championing faith, family, and freedom in public policy and the culture from a biblical worldview. Prior to joining FRC in August 2003, he served in the Louisiana legislature, where he was a leading pro-life, pro-family voice during his tenure as FRC's president. Tony has expanded the organization's reach beyond Washington and has become a major builder of networks of pastors and churches. He also, as I said in my opening comments, did travel to Sudan in 2020, led a religious freedom mission there, and did a tremendous job before, during, and after in trying to, again, bring the blessings of religious liberty to a place that is so incredibly challenged. We'll then hear from Ken Isaacs, the Vice President of Programs and Government Relations at Samaritan's Purse. As Vice President of Programs and Government Relations, Ken oversees all international relief projects for Samaritan's Purse. He has more than 35 years of experience in working in the relief and development communities, and his work has taken him to over 150 countries in response to global emergencies resulting from wars, complex crises, famines, and natural disasters. I would point out that I and members of this subcommittee and our staff often ask Ken for insights about what's happening in a given country, the work of Samaritan's Purse, both internationally and domestically, and even during the COVID crisis. I remember we had one of your top docs who contracted COVID and made his way back here and actually survived and persevered, but he came and testified and did a tremendous job coming out of Sierra Leone and Liberia as he did. We'll then hear from Ms. Nicole Widdersheim. Am I getting that right? The Deputy Washington Director at Human Rights Watch with more than 25 years of experience at the intersection of foreign policy, human rights, and national security. She brings a deep expertise in U.S. government processes and extensive field experience in conflict zones and political crises, including Afghanistan, Cote d'Ivoire, South Sudan, and Cambodia. I would also note, as I indicated in my opening comments, she spent 7 years in Sudan, and that's hard work, and thank you for that work under very trying times. It was there when I led a delegation that went to Mukjar, and that was just an amazing experience for me, and I hope it was good for you. But the hope that those people had, which has now been dashed under the current crisis. So, Mr. Perkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Jacobs, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. As Chairman Smith mentioned, I served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom from 2018 to 2022, served as both vice chair and chair, and I currently serve as president of the Family Research Council, where we care deeply about protecting and promoting fundamental human rights. Foremost among those is religious freedom. In Congress, in part because of your leadership, Mr. Chairman, recognized the strategic importance of this principle when Congress enacted the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998. And research since then has affirmed what RFRA presupposed, that countries that safeguard religious freedom experience greater social stability and, in many cases, stronger economic performance, conditions that are desperately needed in war-torn Sudan. In 2020, while serving on the USERF Commission, I participated in, I think, what is the most recent USERF visit to Sudan. During that trip, I met with the transitional Prime Minister, Hamdok, who was, I think, taking meaningful steps to improve religious freedom. And those reforms actually led to Sudan's removal from the U.S. list of countries of particular concern after 20 years. But sadly, the progress we witness has collapsed, and ethnic and religious-driven violence has again engulfed the country. Sudan is once more making headlines for horrific violence, which is driving an international humanitarian crisis. But this current calamity cannot be understood in isolation. Since gaining independence in 1956, Sudan has been plagued by conflict. The danger today is assuming that this problem is new, rather than addressing the deeply rooted drivers of instability. Sudan does not need a temporary pause in fighting. It needs a durable peace that confronts these underlying causes. While the Rapid Support Forces are rightly condemned for atrocities, both major armed factions bear responsibility for the violence. The Sudanese armed forces have also committed brutal abuses, including killings and beheadings of civilians. Neither faction represents a credible path toward long-term stability or respect for human rights. Many will recall Omar al-Bashir, who ruled from 1989 to 2019. He created the militias, the predecessors of today's RSF, as instruments of jihadist ethnic cleansing against Christians and African tribes. At that time, the RSF and the SAF, they actually worked together. They only became rivals after the coup that removed al-Bashir. The extremist ideologies and structures that fueled past persecution continue to animate both armed groups today. Although the RSF and the SAF are fighting each other, they share a common hostility toward Christian communities, whom they do not view as fitting their vision for the future of Sudan. Churches have been targeted by both factions. Christians have been denied food, aid, and told, quote, "unless you leave your Christianity, no food for you." They and countless Muslims, Africans, and other vulnerable communities are the true victims of this war. Regional actors are further complicating the conflict. The United Arab Emirates' support for the RSF is well known, but Egypt, Iran, Turkey, and Russia have also sought influence, providing drones, weapons, or economic incentives. Sudan's government recently offered Russia a naval base in Port Sudan, an indicator of the geopolitical stakes. Now, the humanitarian crisis is staggering. Nearly 12 million people are internally displaced, and more than 4 million have already fled the country. Many are now in Chad, Egypt, and South Sudan, nations whose fragile infrastructures cannot sustain this influx. The Nuba Mountains, long vulnerable to both famine and persecution, urgently require aid that is not obstructed nor manipulated by either the SAF or the RSF. Reports indicate that more than 150,000 people have been killed in the conflict over the past few years, and the toll continues to rise. The international community, including the United States, cannot remain passive. Sudan was designated a country of particular concern for religious freedom from 1999 to 2019. After the 2019 transition, meaningful reforms, including the repealing of apostasy laws and improving protections for minorities, led to the removal from the CPC list. Today, however, Sudan has reverted to conditions that meet the statutory criteria for CPC designation under RFRA. The safeguards that once existed have collapsed, and the extremist structures that long persecuted Christians and other minorities are again driving violence. Given this dramatic backsliding, the United States should reimpose the CPC designation and make clear it will remain in place until verifiable improvements in religious freedom and human rights occur. So here are the recommendations. Use the CPC and related IRFA tools to press for human rights and accountability. These designations should inform all U.S. engagement with Sudanese factions and regional actors fueling the conflict. Promote federalism and decentralized governance. The centralized state dominated by one armed group will only perpetuate bloodshed. Empowering regional governance structures is essential for long-term peace. Ensure direct humanitarian access to the Nuba Mountains and other besieged regions. Aid must reach civilians without interference from the SAF and the RSF. And partner with Sudan's churches. I met with many of these religious leaders when I was there. They're very concerned. This is both Muslim, Christian, that are concerned about their communities and willing to engage, and they have credibility. As I close, I just want to offer a reflection drawn from my visit to Sudan. 5 years ago, as I stood in Khartoum at the point where the Blue Nile and the White Nile converge to form the great river that flows north through Africa. Each tributary has its own origin and path, yet they meet, and I stood at the single point that shapes everything downstream. It really is a picture. Sudan stands at such a confluence today. Its troubled history meets a present moment filled with danger, but also with possibility of renewal. What flows from this convergence will determine not only Sudan's future, but also the stability of the entire region. My hope is that the United States will use its diplomatic, humanitarian, and economic tools to help ensure that what flows forward is justice, peace, and genuine freedom for all Sudanese people.
Ms. Perkins, thank you so very much for your testimony. Mr. Isaacs.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Jacobs, committee members, and fellow guests, thank you for the opportunity to share my experiences, my thoughts on the crisis in Sudan. I can't remember how many times I've been in this room making testimonies. And I've been working in Sudan since 1993. So what is it that keeps the cycle going? It's a legitimate question. Why do we keep coming back in here and talking about Darfur? Who remembers Save Darfur? It's gone. There was a civil war in the South, and now we have another war between the RSF and SAF. What is that string of commonality? In my opinion, it is Islamic extremism. It's the same Islamic extremism that we see in other groups. That would be Hamas, Hezbollah. It is in that part of the world. And we talk about, when I look at Sudan today, I see a new epicenter forming of regional conflict. And the countries that are involved today, the United States, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, Russia, China, Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, and Libya. And there's probably more that I don't know about. This involvement is noted not to assign any blame, but to demonstrate that the scale of geopolitical investment in Sudan's outcome is staggering. Regional actors are coalescing, each with a vested interest. Ending the war cannot be achieved by isolating any one actor, but it's going to require coordinated restraint among many. Since 1989, Sudanese politics have been dominated by ideological positioning driven by the Muslim Brotherhood. The National Congress Party, led by Omar al-Bashir, who I've met on several occasions, took control of the government, and the Brotherhood-linked National Congress Party grew from being a political party into the ideological spine of a militarized Islamist state with a violent footprint across the country. As a perpetrator of this violence, Bashir created the Janjaweed militia in the early 2000s as a tool to control insurgency in Darfur. In 2013, the NCP formalized the Janjaweed by presidential decree into a paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces. In 2019, after months of mass civilian protests demanding an end, this is the people of Sudan raising up. They demanded an end to Islamist authoritarian rule, and Sudan's military removed President Omar Bashir and formed a transitional government with civilian leaders. This transitional council collapsed in October of 2021 when military leaders, reportedly led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and supported by General Mohammed Dagalo Hamedi, staged a coup, detaining Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok and dissolving the civilian government. Then in April of 2023, this alliance fractured and Khartoum dissolved into open conflict, which has absolutely burnt the country. The current civil war has seen the RSF position itself against the state that created it. It is crucial to keep these historical and ideological roots in mind. Both the SAF and the RSF grew out of the same ideological fabric that is woven deeply into Sudanese power structures. It is not just a fight between two generals. It is a legacy of entrenched Islamist political networks that now stand at odds with each other. You've heard the numbers many times today. My version of them are this: an estimated 30.4 million people, roughly 2/3 of the Sudanese population, need humanitarian assistance. 21 million people face acute food insecurity, and 6.5 million are in or near total famine conditions. Famine has been declared in different locations across Sudan 3 separate times over the past 2 years, with the latest declaration occurring in November, this time in El Fasher, in Darfur, and Kadugli in South Kordofan, with 20 additional locations considered at risk of famine. All of this famine talk sounds it's technical, but what it translates into is seeing people dying on the ground because they don't have food. I know these things because Samaritan's Purse has been involved 2 times in 2 years in statistically proving, which is a very exhausting process, that famine has existed, that it meets the benchmarks of famine. Most recently in El Fasher, some reports state that as many as 60,000 people have been brutally murdered. I trust that all of you have seen the videos of these because it's horrific. The country has descended into an intractable war that has no military conclusion except for the continued loss of civilian life. The SAF and the RSF must be compelled to accept a ceasefire. I also want to point out there's a lot of talk today, even coming from me and others, about humanitarian needs. But you cannot solve a political problem with a humanitarian solution. I've learned that in over 35 years of doing this. The first and overriding priority must be to stop the war. The fastest way to accomplish that is to pressure both sides to accept a ceasefire. In order to actualize it, it will require observation by a credible international body. I'm actually thinking of a group of EU monitors and not something like the UN peacekeepers that were in Darfur back when you were there. In order, this body needs the broad political support and the authorities necessary to monitor and to enact enforcement on both sides by the terms of the ceasefire agreement, utilizing political and economic leveraging. The second requirement is humanitarian access. There's been a lot said about that today. Sudan's civilians are not simply caught in the crossfire, they're being starved by the collapse of all of the economic and social mechanisms in their society. Aid corridors must be open and confidently provide safe passage into Darfur, Kordofan, Khartoum, Jazeera, all without taxation, diversion, or interference. Humanitarian access cannot be optional. It must be negotiated and guaranteed at the beginning of the ceasefire. Thirdly, a civilian transitional authority must be reconstituted. It cannot be symbolic, and it should be drawn from across Sudan. As Sudanese society is multi-ethnic, a wider civilian body is required for nationhood. Both primary forces in this war emerged from the same security architecture, and I think it's important to remember that. That system fused governance from ideological patronage and armed structures. The people of Sudan want this legacy corrected. That's what they voted for in 2019. Sudan will not move forward if its political identity and security apparatus remain defined by structures born of ideological brutality. Sudan requires a civilian constitutional structure that protects worship while ending the conflation of armed power with religious identity. The state should not use religion to dominate and exclude. A state in which Sudanese may freely worship is only possible if the political authority is accountable to civilians, but not to the military command and theological claims. The United States is well served by a clear policy that prevents flirting with the ideological and organizational network from which emerged Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and other armed movements whose destabilizing consequences now reach from Gaza to the Red Sea. President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio are to be applauded for recognizing the dangers of the Muslim Brotherhood and moving to declare them as a foreign terrorist organization. Sudan can be stable and functioning with a civilian constitutional framework where faith is protected and politics are not defined by military force. A stable, functioning Sudan is not a favor to the world, but it is an American interest. A stable Sudan will make America stronger, safer, and more prosperous. I want to thank President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio for paying attention to this matter, and I also want to thank the members of the Quad for their efforts. That includes the United States, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. My last statement is this: this war will not produce a victor. The war must end. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ken, for your testimony and your leadership. Nicole, the floor is yours.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Jacobs, and your committee colleagues, thank you so much for having this hearing today. I come to you from Human Rights Watch, but I've also had a long time in USAID, and I also served in the National Security Council as the Sudan's and Central Africa director under the first Trump administration. Congressman Smith, when I was with you on the helicopter on our way to Mukjar, I remember you were not feeling very well, and you said we must go and hear from these people. This Mukjar was one of the scenes of one of the most horrific Janjaweed attacks, and they lined the streets, as you remember, and you sat there under a tree for many hours in the Sudan heat and listened to story after story. And I'm so glad that you remembered it. I remember it distinctively. And you've never wavered in your interest and support for Sudan. And unfortunately, I think we're all here telling you that the violence that we see today is on par, if possibly not worse, than when you visited 20 years ago. So Human Rights Watch takes no US government money or no government money at all. We work in over 90 countries, and we just work to verify and document human rights abuses. We've been documenting many human rights abuses in Sudan. April 2026 will mark 3 years since a brutal war broke out in Sudan, and this conflict has been primarily a war of abuse and atrocities on civilians by both sides, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. Multiple Human Rights Watch investigations illustrate Sudan's nationwide human rights crisis. This October in Darfur, the RSF carried out mass atrocities, as we've all talked about today, after an 18-month-long siege in the city, which was once a vibrant place that hosted many survivors of the previous campaigns of attacks over the last 20 years by the Janjaweed and then the RSF. El Fasher was the last city controlled by the SAF and their allies in Darfur. The RSF takeover of the city resulted in massacres that the RSF fighters were filming themselves committing, were bragging about. My organization, Human Rights Watch, took all those videos and verified their authenticity. They geospatially recorded them and cited them, and they are accurate, they are true, but it is unbelievable that exists now in our minds and on the internet. They also killed one of the last remaining journalists, Taj Al-Sur Ahmed Suleiman, in El Fasher with his relatives, and I believe we were hearing that it happened right in his house. Human Rights Watch had previously documented similar atrocities by the RSF 2 years earlier. We knew this was going to happen in some sense because we knew what their tactics were and that they've never been held accountable for what they were doing. In Ardamata, outside of El Geneina, they conducted a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the ethnic Masalit and other non-Arab tribes in 2023. We concluded there that the RSF had carried out crimes against humanity, widespread war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. And the thing that my colleagues who documented what they did in Ardamata noted is that after they had the military victory of taking over that area, They then shot the civilians. It was not during the military campaign. They shot them in the back, trying to flee the RSF. And the same with El Fasher. Once they took over that city, that is when the killing started. And that tells us this is an ethnic cleansing campaign, and these very likely are acts of genocide. Over 2.5 years, the list of civilian targeting and suffering is unrelenting, and it's spreading across the country. In South Kordofan, RSF and allied militia committed war crimes against Nuba civilians and gang rapes and holding women and girls in the context of sexual slavery, destroying homes, and displacing tens of thousands of people. We saw throughout the course of this war in Khartoum, women and girls that faced widespread sexual violence, rape, forced marriage, child marriage. And this has been primarily at the hands of the RSF fighters, and survivors have been denied medical care and justice. These abuses amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, the title of this hearing today. The Sudanese armed forces have also committed war crimes, most notably indiscriminate airstrikes that have killed civilians and injured scores of others and destroyed homes and hospitals. I think it just bears repeating that both of these parties are targeting civilians in this war. The army itself has transformed areas that are now back under its control into massive detention sites and subjecting civilians to widespread detention and abuse, and often holding the civilians guilty for just having been living in the RSF areas that the SAF conquered. These forces all continue to benefit from widespread impunity. These forces who know that they can get away with it, they know so well they can get away with it that they're filming themselves with no fear. Right now, civilians in Kordofan region are being attacked and are at imminent risk of mass atrocities to the level and the volume that we saw in El Fasher just 2 months ago. The international community has failed to listen to the warnings and heed the lessons from the first Darfur genocide in 2005, all the way through to the Janjaweed morphing into the RSF and committing violence act after act in Darfur, through to the coup in 2021. We're here to warn you today. We cannot let this level of suffering become normalized. International response to the crisis has been pathetic. Cycles of limited, energized, uncoordinated activities by US government over 2 administrations have produced failed, isolated efforts. The African Union has been both sidelined from diplomatic efforts like the Jeddah process and the current Quad process, which includes US, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. And then they've also sat and admired the problem in Addis with meeting after meeting at the Peace and Security Commission. The African Union does have a role to protect civilians and deal with this crisis as well as other multilateral institutions. Nothing has been done notable to date. There's been little communication from our current administration to the human rights community on what is the strategy on Sudan. From the outside, it appears that the US and the Quad do not have a completely clear strategy for stopping the attacks on civilians and stopping the human rights violations on the civilian population. Yes, the UN humanitarian chief, Tom Fletcher, recently visited Sudan and has demanded, like Ken and others, unfettered access for humanitarian response. But again, these have all been acts and words. Acts with words and no action, excuse me. The United States government is a major actor in the situation and can do much more than it has. The US Congress has played a monumental role, often led by yourself, Chairman Smith, in the past, exposing atrocity crimes, elevating the Sudanese civilian voice and survivors' needs, appropriating life-saving assistance, guiding and overseeing the US foreign policy in the country for Republican and Democratic administrations alike. This country, our country, has played the most pivotal role in supporting the Sudanese civilians. But in my 27 years working on Sudan and South Sudan, I have never seen the US government writ large so unengaged on the region. The U.S. is losing its moral credibility in the world and in Sudan. Yes, public condemnation can signal to the perpetrators of these horrible crimes that the U.S. is watching, but social media posts and press releases are simply not enough. There's so much more you can do to help the Sudanese people survive this terrible time and be safe from violence and work towards a fully civilian-led, rights-respecting democratic Sudan, one that they fought for and lost their lives for in 2019. So we have 10 points, and I encourage, with any of these points and any of these recommendations you've heard today, that you pick up either the draft Sudan Peace Act that has been introduced by Ranking Member Jacobs, or you draft new legislation. But pass some legislation that puts some hard recommendations and helps guide the administration and President Trump on his newfound interest in Sudan to bring peace. We want you to nominate, and we'd like the White House to nominate a congressionally required presidential special envoy for Sudan. It should be a presidential envoy, so it answers both to the White House and it works with you. Secondly, we support the deployment of a multilateral or a multinational or regional force to protect civilians now. It can start small, deploying where civilians are in need of most urgent protection, like in Kordofan right now, today. But it needs to start as soon as possible. History has shown that a small contingent of well-trained, well-equipped troops can do a lot of good in a very short period of time where civilians are under immediate risk. Congress should communicate to the administration and Ambassador Waltz in the UN that you support this. We know standing up new peacekeeping operations is not in favor right now, but this is needed in Sudan, unfortunately. My third recommendation is to call on all countries to comply with the UN Security Council arms embargo. It's been in place for 20 years, and it is readily violated. And it's violated by people that our government says are their allies. Sorry, countries that our government says are their allies. We can do a lot to influence those countries. We ask that you try to insist that the administration put the Sudanese civilians first in any and all work that they're doing with the Quad or with seeking any political solution. This current war in Sudan, and some arguably could say the past explosions of violence over the last 20 years, have been between actors that we're all familiar with. And there's never been a space carved out for Sudanese civilians to be the third actor and the lead actor in governing their own country and finding peace and finding solutions. So we really encourage that with the hope that President Trump can do something on this crisis, that this includes the Sudanese civilians. Our fifth recommendation is to authorize and appropriate robust U.S. funding. We know that USAID has been closed and the U.S. government was the largest donor for the longest bit of time in Sudan. And that probably was unbalanced and not necessarily a global burden sharing approach. But right now, particularly the emergency response rooms that you've heard mentioned already, they need our support. We need more aid. It is not enough. We have gutted our tools for atrocity prevention, early warning, documentation by dropping democracy, rights, and labor down to a shell of itself. We've cut the staff and the funding by nearly 80%. We've gotten rid of the Global Criminal Justice Office in the State Department that would help the State Department and the White House verify and legally define these crimes that we're witnessing. And that's up to you, Congress, to either reappropriate these funds and make sure that all the tools to respond to these atrocities still exist in our government, or build them anew. But the point is, this crisis needs that. Impose targeted sanctions. It's good to see that we have targeted many of the actors in this crisis, but we also need to use the global Magnitsky sanctioning tool. It's tougher, and it targets corruption and human rights abuses alike. So there's still pressure to put on there. Support the UN fact-finding mission. Congress has appropriated to pay our UN dues. The UN fact-finding mission on Sudan works with our resources and these type of special mechanisms in the UN that will document the crimes that you're discussing today and you want to hear from us about, need that contribution from a country like the United States. We recall across the administrations that there has been critical work by the International Criminal Court on Sudan. Just this October, finally, one person was found guilty of 27 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity. This has been literally the only person in 20 years brought to justice for all that's been done in Sudan and for the people who have survived and perished in these wars. We encourage the Congress to support the work of the ICC. It's doing vital work that doesn't exist anyplace else for Sudan. It continues to work on Ukraine and other crises in the world. And so we ask that you indicate to the administration that you do support the work of the ICC. I know this is tough right now and it's not particularly popular, but Sudan needs justice and it has only suffered from impunity, and we see what we get when we hold nobody accountable. To conclude, when I take Human Rights Watch investigations and reports to the offices here on the Hill over and over again, Democrats and Republicans alike, I mean, some of our new generation of staffers will say, well, why should we care about Sudan? And I think that's a fair question. The world seems to be on fire right now. But the level of violence and killing here demonstrates for us that basic humanity is under attack. And we are all witnessing it on our phones. And we are becoming numb, and it's becoming normalized. To do nothing when we have the leverage as a country like the United States does to stop and lessen the nature of this violence and keep our stature and moral authority, that what's ever left of it in the world, and how we have been side by side with the Sudanese for so long, it is a grand test of the U.S. values. It is a threat on our own security, as Ken has said, and our credibility in the world. Sudan sits at a crossroad in a very unstable region, surrounded by Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and the Red Sea. History has demonstrated that when mass atrocities happen on this level, it does not stick to inside borders. Congress can play a pivotal role ensuring the U.S. government is clear and coordinated and has measures that prioritize the protection of civilians, justice, and humanitarian relief with a concerted engagement and pressure on the parties to the conflict. With this approach, led by Congress and in partnership with the White House and President Trump, you can break the cycle of mass atrocities and help the Sudanese people begin to recover, be safer, and hopefully have a viable chance to govern their own country. Thank you for hearing from us today.
Ms. Widdersheim, thank you so much for your testimony, for your extraordinary leadership over the many, many years. You know, on the point, not to belabor the point, but on the point of, you know, why should we care? First and foremost, we're our brothers and sisters keepers. We should love our neighbor as ourselves and go the extra mile when such horrible atrocities are being committed to stop it. But there's also, and Ken Isaacs in his testimony makes this point about, you know, that we are not unaffected. Osama bin Laden was in Khartoum. When I met with the president of Bashir, he made fun and mocked that the United States were offered to the Clinton administration that we take Osama bin Laden. And I even met with Salma Ghosh, who was one of his terrible, terrible people who was known for his torture. And I talked to him because I had to talk to him because he said, you got to talk to, and he was in the next room. And the bottom line was that he was offered. We said no under Clinton, and he went to Afghanistan, he being Osama bin Laden. And I had 37 people in one of my larger towns in Middletown killed by 9/11, 750 New Jerseyans, and all the others, World Trade, of course, and right here at the Pentagon, right nearby, and in Pennsylvania. All of that could have been stopped if we had just brought this monster called Osama bin Laden. But again, and you also pointed out, Ken, in your statement, which I thought was interesting, that our embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi were bombed, and that was hatched in Khartoum. I held the hearings with Admiral Crow, sitting right where you are, on embassy security, and wrote the law, the Embassy Security Act, because our embassies were so at risk and did not have the kind of protection, including the visuals, to ensure that setbacks and all the other thing. But again, where did it come from? Americans died, and of course, people in those two countries from the car bombs that were set off there, all hatched in Khartoum. So let's not, Americans should say, oh, why are we caring about? We care because we should care, but we also care because it doesn't stop there. It extends out, and you gave, Ken, and so did you, Nicole, some really good reasons for that. Let me just, on the CPC to Mr. Perkins, I do think that ought to be done right away, so we'll make an all-out effort following your lead to the president to do that right away. As you pointed out, they had it for 20 years, and then things changed, and that gives an additional set of things that the president can do vis-a-vis Sudan. On the foreign terrorist organization designation for the Hemedti's group, that ought to be done right away to at least have an additional way of finding out where he's getting his funds and weapons. We know UAE is guilty up to their ears with and eyes in providing this. I would hope the president would call the leadership there and say, stop it. There needs to be that kind, in my opinion. Marco Rubio is a tremendous Secretary of State, but go to that next level and say, that's it. Delay is denial. More people will die tomorrow, next day, if this isn't done right away. So my hope is that we will get that high-level focus from the president himself to just do this. Stop it, and you provide all the testimony we need, in this forum, and others are doing it elsewhere to make that case. I did talk to the chairman of the Foreign Ops Committee, Mario Diaz-Balart. I've been talking to him all the time, but I talked to him in between these votes, and he said, they're looking to really, fund to a way that is very, very significant, all these efforts. So that bill has not passed yet, but we've just got to do it. World Food Program, I go to their website and look at all the losses they have there in terms of underfunding, and people die from hunger when they're not fed, and the money has to be provided. So UAE, we all should shout from the rooftops, stop it now. Same goes for the military. We don't have as much impact on what Iran does as we do with Saudi Arabia. So the Quad, while it seems to be, it's there, it looks good, just like some of the things that happened at the African Union. But when do they, just say, hey, if this was your family that was getting slaughtered and your wife that was being raped, what would you do? You wouldn't stop until it was stopped. And that's the kind of sense of urgency that we hope this will bring, this hearing and your testimony speaking truth to power. So you did say about compel them to, the players, again, to act, to enact a ceasefire. I'm not sure how we do compel them. Maybe you want to elaborate on that. And just what happens in the next week or more as people don't get food and as more killing happens. We can't get compassion fatigue. We just can't. We just have to re-triple our efforts. And again, I think this president is sitting in a very, very enviable place to say, that's it. And UAE, that will make, I think, a huge difference. We do have the resolution. I've introduced it, joined by my good friend and colleague, and my colleagues to my right, calling for that special envoy. Have another person. And as I said in the last panel, there would have been no Sudan success without Senator Danforth, who I thought did an amazing job in the past. I just throw that out that we got to get that. I did not get a sense from the Assistant Secretary that they will do that. We're going to follow up on that, but he thought that Bulus and certainly Marco Rubio's drinking from a fire hose here. He's got so many crises that he's trying to manage. Having that very well-positioned person to do it could help make a difference. But the president needs to pick up the phone. Your thoughts, and then I'll yield to my friend. Again, yes. Oh, good.
A few more comments.
Please.
So in Nuba Mountains, I don't tell everybody this, but I'm getting ready to tell everybody this. We've been running a cross-border operation for 13 years, taking about 16,000 tons of food a year into Nuba Mountains and distributing it to 400,000 to 600,000 people. There's a lot of other aspects, healthcare, nutrition, that go with that program. I have 400 staff inside of Nuba Mountains, so I've got a pretty good network there to know what's going on. And last year, and this is an important point, we entered into a discussion with the Sudan Armed Forces and the SPLM North, and they came to an agreement for a 90-day ceasefire, and we airdropped 2,700 tons of food into an area of famine. My point in sharing this is that humanitarian ceasefires can happen, and they do respect them. Now, the day after the agreement was over, they went back to war. Boom, right back. But we were able to airdrop the food. I had staff on the ground, and we oversaw the distributions. And the government of Sudan, that is the Sudan Armed Forces, I went to Port Sudan. I met with General Burhan. I met with the other generals, head of GIS, and some of their co-workers are in here today. They came and visited with us. It is possible to get agreements. It's not easy, but it's possible. I think in preparation to come and talk to you today, I spoke with former Prime Minister Hamdok. I spoke with Hamedi. I spoke with civil society people. I spoke with Abdul Wahid. I spoke as many people as I could. 3 senior people told me there's only one person that can fix this. It's President Trump. And so I want to echo back to what Sam Brownback said, and that is that I think that the two of you are in a very unique position to be a catalyst and an encourager. You know, it's almost like President Trump's in a unique slot and window for this conflict where he could get the attention of the leaders and twist their arms, break their legs. I don't know what, because your question is relevant. How do you get that done? It's easy to conceptualize it. The implementation of it's a different thing. But I do feel like that President Trump is the guy that can get that done. He is the man for this job right now. That's all I have. Thank you.
I just want to say I've read your 10 points very carefully. I thank you for them. And the first one was the special envoy, but the others as well, TSP, the other, all things that need to be very, very seriously embraced. So I do thank you for that. And I was very sick that day. You noticed. I had gotten my yellow fever shot too late, and I had a fever. But thank you. You were there, and it was very, very meaningful. And what it just opened up my eyes like nothing else.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Widdersheim, I want to start with you. Would you agree that the UAE is in violation of the UN arms embargo by providing weapons to the RSF?
So it seems like it's the worst kept diplomatic secret. When we talk to governments, including our own, under the Biden administration and throughout the Western democracies, diplomats tell us all the time, we know what they're doing. My organization continues to try to look into this from an arms perspective in what is being found in Sudan and in amongst the RSF areas, but access is completely cut off. It's cut off for food, it's cut off for humanitarian assistance. But it seems like everybody who could stop the UAE, including the UN, who has noted their involvement in their panel of experts reporting, knows their involvement. So it's like this strange circle of not fully addressing the matter. And when you are watching mass atrocities and genocides unfold, the number one thing that you and it's been part of my work to study this and look at this. The number one thing you must do is you must cut off the resources for the people who are committing the mass atrocities. And that is money, that is arms, and it is people. So we were very encouraged to see the sanctions that were announced yesterday by the Trump administration, or maybe it was the day before, on the Colombian companies that are sending mercenaries. This is a start. It's a good start. But you have to cut off all the resources in order to stop the killing. It actually is that simple. It's simple to say and simple to see the through line. It's not simple to do, apparently.
Thank you. And what do you think it would take for the UAE to stop arming the RSF, or at the very least use its significant leverage to get the RSF to stop their atrocities?
I mean, the UAE needs to hear from its allies. The United States is in a defense pact with UAE. If Sudan matters to us, we need to use our relationship with that country to get it to stop. And so, I do agree this is a moment in time and an opportunity for this president and this White House to actually exert the full amount of its pressure and use that relationship. These relationships and these alliedships around the world only matter when your allies are doing something you don't like. You have to use those relationships.
Thank you. And so I guess just to be a little bit more specific, do you think it's appropriate for the U.S. to be selling weapons to the UAE right now while they continue to support the RSF?
My organization hasn't gotten to a definitive decision on that. There is speculation that while U.S. weapons have not been found in Darfur, that weapon sales to UAE is allowing them to displace their old stocks and send those weapons to Darfur. So I think we have to look very carefully at this in order to make sure that no U.S. weapons wind up hurting people in Sudan.
Thank you. And now I'd like to turn to the ICC. Earlier this year, Eric Iverson, a decorated U.S. Army veteran who is currently the lead prosecutor in the court's Darfur cases, filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration, arguing that the administration's sanctions against ICC prosecutor Karim Khan prevented him from investigating and prosecuting mass atrocities in Darfur. In response, the Treasury Department granted him a license for his work with the ICC, and Mr. Iverson withdrew his suit. But as you know, this license is specific to him and doesn't cover other U.S. citizens who work for the ICC prosecutor's office or contractors. We've seen reports that sanctions on Khan have substantially impeded ICC investigations. This is despite successive U.S. presidential administrations since the George W. Bush administration, including the Trump administration, expressing support for accountability for atrocity crimes in Darfur. Why are the ICC investigations into atrocity crimes in Darfur important? And could you tell us sort of your assessment of if alternatives exist to the ICC?
Sure. So an organization like mine that legally defines and documents these crimes really relies on institutions like the International Criminal Court to bring justice to the victims. The ICC currently has 11 active cases on Sudan. Its mandate was established in 2005, and it extends to now. There is no other entity. Their courts are not functioning inside Sudan. The African Union doesn't offer a viable alternative to the ICC for the crimes being committed in Sudan. There is no other entity that is going to have the chance to bring any justice to the grave and mass crimes in Sudan. And the other thing to note about the ICC is that even if there are carve-outs and things to allow for work in places and on cases that maybe the United States is fine with, these sanctions represent a chilling effect for anybody to work with the ICC. Banks, service providers, logistics providers, all these things that you just need to have an entity function. It really does chill its work on Ukraine, on Russia, on Sudan, on Central African Republic, and on Gaza. It's true. So while there's no other entity around, I think the most important thing is that we see 20 years of impunity lead to more mass atrocities. It's that simple.
And do you believe that the specific license for Mr. Iverson fixes the chilling problem and other impediments that these sanctions have on the Darfur investigation?
I'd like to take that question back to our international justice team because I don't know the ins and outs of what that license covers. I'm sorry to say.
No, that's fine. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and the young lady yields back. And so now I have the opportunity to recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. So I'm going to start off with you, Mr. Isaacs, and you know, you've worked in over 150 countries to respond to war. You've responded to famine. You've been in some very complex crises. So you're overseeing U.S. humanitarian relief in Darfur, a critical region in Sudan that has currently used and underscored as rife for famine and heavily impacted by the civil war, as you've been talking about. So how would you characterize the conflict's direct effect on Sudan's food security?
I would characterize it as in the sewer. It's a horrible situation. We're talking about Kordofan. So Kordofan is a state sort of in the southern central part. And we've worked there, I've been 25 or 28 years there. Over the last year, almost 3 million people have come into that area. Why have they come into that area? It's a legitimate question. They've come there because they're voting with their feet. They feel security. They're not coming there because there's food. That's an issue. And the number one driver in famine is man-made problems. It's not nature. It's not climate change. It's not crop failure. It's man-made problems. And as has been said here today several times, this famine is a man-made issue. People are running from their land. They can't farm. Business has been curtailed. Logistics supply is cut off. And everybody that is surviving is focused on survival. They're not focused on, and they can't be focused on producing food. There has been and there are deliberate interruptions in humanitarian supplies. Congressman, I'm a Christian working as a humanitarian. I'm not a politician. It troubles me today, and it's troubled me for years, for people to pick the low-hanging fruit of getting food in. I know that food needs to get in, but it is not going to solve the political problems that exist in the country. And if those political problems are not addressed, all you're going to have is a season of feeding at a vast cost. And in this cycle, that's why I said I've been in this room so many times giving these testimonies in other rooms over in the Senate and all around on the Hill. Nothing has fundamentally changed in the structure and the governance of Sudan to the point that it can feed itself. Sudan is bigger than the state of Texas. It's got the Nile River that runs through it. It's got 10 months a year of beautiful sunshine, water, fertile soil. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. I mean, they've got all of the raw elements there in addition to gold and oil and whatever other minerals they've got. It should be a wealthy country, and it's not. It has to do with the governance. So I'm very concerned about protection of children. I'm very concerned about education. I'm very concerned about gender-based violence. The governance has to change, or it won't go away.
Thank you. You know, I fought in Vietnam, and so I kind of understand the sacrifices people make because of governance, as you talk about. And it's really sad to see young children that are malnourished, and we're not, and they got the raw materials. My background is in agriculture, so my gosh, if I've got land and I've got some way to fertilize it and I got some seed, I can do something with it. So it's really sad to see a government that's over that kind of people and not taking advantage of the raw materials they have. And so, you know, when some people say they ought to stop, I think that's true. But somebody needs to kick their can. But anyway, I can empathize with your comments. So I got about 12 seconds, and so I really appreciate your comments. And so with that, I guess we will go to Washington with Ms. Jayapal.
She's not back
here.
yet, so I'll
Okay.
take ranking member's prerogative and ask a few more questions, if that's all right. Okay, so in my opening remarks, I talked about Sudan's community-led emergency response rooms, or ERRs, and how they've been essential to the survival of the Sudanese people, providing basic meals for civilians throughout the country through community-run kitchens that were previously supported in part by USAID funding. The Trump administration's aid cuts forced nearly 80% of ERR activities to stop and affected the operations of over 1,460 community kitchens. Now, the United States no longer provides any direct funding to the ERRs. Ms. Widdersheim, can you explain to the committees why the ERRs are so critical to providing life-saving aid to the Sudanese communities and why they are more efficient and effective at delivering aid?
Thanks. Thank you for the question. And I would note that we have some members of the ERRs and their representatives here to hear this hearing today. And
Thank you all for everything that you do.
and some of them also have lost relatives in this recent round of fighting in El Fasher. The ERRs, well, let me just start a little bit in putting my former USAID hat on. When I worked in Sudan and other places with USAID, it was always clear, and I think that USAID tried over the years to do this, is to really focus resources towards localization. And the ERRs represented the epitome and almost a perfect example of that type of localization, where if you got them not a ton of money, they were so much more efficient, and they lived there. They lived in these villages, and they served these emergency response rooms and soup kitchens right there in the community that they were from. And they knew the people, and they knew how to cross lines. They were actually peacemakers in trying to get their humanitarian assistance and keep their kitchen serving people right there among the belligerents and the parties to this conflict. And so it was a cheaper way to get food in. It was a way to access places where international and UN entities could not get to or had fled from. And it was truly keeping people alive. So, you know, the fact that that has gone away, particularly from the US government, is just really crushing and heartbreaking. Because as USAID was folded and dissolved, one of the things that I heard over and over again was that it wasn't efficient, or it was too expensive. And yet we have this mechanism that already was homegrown and would be there after, hopefully after, it was there before, during the Democratic Revolution on the streets of Khartoum. That's where it was founded from. And it has continued to operate, and it's already there and established. And we need to get some more resources than currently are going now back to them. The other thing that they do is that even if they're getting a trickle of food aid from the United States or from the World Food Program, they're also doing so much more than just food aid. And when you have a crisis of this magnitude, people have lost everything. They've lost their farming tools. Women don't have access to hygiene products, to basic neonatal care, all of these things that an emergency brings in addition to food and famine. So I would just highly recommend that this body, Congress and writ large, that has the power of the purse in our government, really try to work to get funding reestablished to the emergency response rooms.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Mr. Isaacs, a question for you. Prior to Samaritan's Purse, you worked at USAID, where you were in charge of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. You recently published a book titled Running to the Fire, Helping in Jesus' Name, that details all of your humanitarian work in disaster contexts. In Sudan, the United States has been the top donor for years, but the foreign aid cuts by this administration have left many Sudanese communities abandoned. For example, Hanan, an internally displaced person, now no longer can afford her medication or food. She tried to compensate for lost food by relying on meals from a nearby community kitchen, but then the U.S. funding cuts forced that kitchen to close. And as of this month, Sudan's 2025 humanitarian appeal of $4.16 billion is only 35% funded. What impacts have you seen on the U.S. foreign aid cuts and USAID's dismantlement, and have you seen it get easier or harder to deliver as much food and other assistance in Sudan as before?
Well, since you mentioned my book, if you wanted to go to Amazon and do a review, it'd be greatly appreciated. Tell me your question again. I want to hear it one more time.
Sure. What impacts have you seen from the U.S. foreign aid cuts and USAID's dismantlement? And have you seen it get easier or harder to deliver as much food and other assistance into Sudan as before?
I don't think that the restriction of the money has improved nor hardened the access issues. The access issues are stimulated from political and military problems. But there's no, I mean, if you've got less money, you can do less things. That's, pretty straightforward mathematics. But I will say this, on the, and it's been an encouraging sign for us, on the Nuba Mountains, the State Department is continuing to engage with us in the cross-border feeding operation, and we're very encouraged by that. There is some reorganization going on and what all the new shops are going to be set up and how that structure is going to work. And I think there's also a growing awareness that the things that existed for a reason, and then many of them need to be brought back. So we're talking about the ERR rooms, and we have an operation in Port Sudan. We're active in Khartoum, or what's left of Khartoum, and we coordinate very closely. Samaritan's Purse is doing that, and we're coordinating very closely with those community organizations, and they do prove to be effective. Other than that, I can't speak to all of the issues, and besides the fact that if you have money, you can buy more resources. But I do, Congresswoman, just want to emphasize how important I believe it is to recognize that you can't solve a political problem with a humanitarian response.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I just want to emphasize, I think we need to be funding the ERRs and the humanitarian response much more. I also think we need a real diplomatic approach that holds the regional actors accountable for their role in perpetuating this conflict. And in the meantime, we need to do everything we can to relieve the suffering. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Ms. Jaipal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing, for all of your commitment on this issue. I also want to thank the ranking member. It's been an issue of tremendous importance to me. I have been working with the Sudanese American diaspora. In 2020, I was on the congressional delegation that went at a moment of great hope, I think, when we thought that we were potentially going to have a real democratic governance in Sudan, and after the courageous civil society effort to overthrow the dictator. It's very difficult to be here now, and I thank you all for your work. I watch those Human Rights Watch videos. They're incredibly difficult, painful to watch, because this is the site of the worst humanitarian crisis we've seen, and the urgency is not there. The energy is not there that needs to be there, and we're not doing everything that we could be doing in this administration, and the last administration have not done what we need to be doing, with over 30 million people needing humanitarian assistance. And I agree with you, Mr. Isaacs, that there isn't you can't solve a political problem with a humanitarian solution, but you also can't ignore the humanitarian crisis that's happening. We really need both. And so, and I do want to make sure that some of the proposals that are being floated to designate the RSF as a foreign terrorist organization do not in any way impede the humanitarian efforts that we also need to make sure are continuing so that more people don't die. And I know that is a concern of humanitarian organizations, that we make sure that if those proposals move forward, that we have a very clear carve-out for humanitarian assistance to continue to make it through. I've been collecting stories from impacted civilians, both Sudanese Americans here, but also the diaspora around the world and in Sudan, and leading an effort to have members of Congress tell those stories so that they themselves see. I know it took me a couple of times recording to get through some of them. They're so incredibly painful. I want to speak to the humanitarian landscape. 375,000 people on the brink of starvation. And at this critical moment, both the SAF and RSF, as you all have said, engaged in the willful obstruction of humanitarian assistance using starvation as a weapon of war. And so, Ms. Widdersheim, could you speak about why armed actors are specifically targeting humanitarian workers in this conflict, and the leverage points that you think that this administration, this Congress, can use to secure increased access for those humanitarian workers?
Well, I'm going to call on Ken to also respond to, because of his expertise in the humanitarian field. I would say over the course of working and learning and trying to respond or help with the U.S. policy on Sudan for so many years, food has often and for generations been a weapon in Sudan. The Bashir government used it against South Sudan. They cut off airdrops and they manipulated food aid. There's probably not one militia or armed actor in Sudan, and at the time South Sudan, when it was still one country, that hasn't learned how to use food as a weapon against their people. So this is a common, tried and true tactic to also cut off humanitarian assistance. And frankly, to Ken's point and to what I think is getting recognized clearly by the committee, that humanitarian assistance isn't a political solution, but it does kind of keep the international community fixated on the humanitarian and not doing the hard work on the political solution.
Sure.
So, it's people we really do need both, as you said.
Yeah.
I think that these armed actors are doing this now because they've always done it. And this is a way in which they get control and they get the population to bend to their will. They get them to move. The RSF has been very fixated on ethnic cleansing. And if you starve people, if they can, they will walk away.
That's
and they
the goal.
will walk into Chad.
I want to get a question in about the UAE, because this is also really, really important. So I'm sorry I'm not giving you a chance to respond on that one. But, the UAE, and the chairman said it, we should be shouting this from every rooftop, is actively supporting the RSF. And despite this clear involvement, this administration blew through the committee's hold on a $1.4 billion sale of helicopters and F-16 fighter jet parts to the UAE. And we're continuing to announce new arms sales to the UAE. So what signal does it send to the UAE when the United States continues to provide them with military equipment, despite the well-documented record of providing weapons to the RSF? And is it possible that American weapons sold to the UAE could end up being used by the RSF in Sudan?
So, not an expert on arms, but I would say it is highly possible that the fluidity of arms flows into Sudan can come from anywhere. And already Canada is seeing Canadian sales ending up in Sudan, according to media reports. So I would just want to say that the committee is right to put these holds and to use all the tools that you have. I think we have to get the tools that are already in place, like the Leahy laws, to scrutinize our sales to all of the actors involved in Sudan in supporting these actors to commit atrocities against their people and the civilians there. And I fear it might be a matter of time. I mean, I just don't know. But we would not want to see American weapons sold to them and wind up in the hands of these actors as they're committing crimes against humanity. So we have some tools in place, your ability to put those holds, to scrutinize those sales, and also to ensure that our government follows the Leahy laws that are on the books. So I just, continue to plead with all members to use the tools at your disposal.
Thank you, and I hope we can do that, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, back.
Thank you so very much, Ms. J. Powell. Let me just ask Mr. Perkins, if you would, your fourth recommendation was to partner with Sudan's churches. And we know that we're seeing in a lot of places where jihadism is rampant, where non-radical Muslims are targeted for killing. We see that in Nigeria. But the Christians are targeted simply because they are Christians. How well are the churches positioned from a safety point of view? And maybe Mr. Isaac, well, any of you might want to speak to that. If they get humanitarian aid, those churches will provide it to everybody and anybody, believing that's right out of the gospel. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, because that's a noble deed to do. But when humanitarian workers, even those coming in on convoys, are being hurt, killed.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. There's a vibrant church community there, and people naturally look often to the church community for help.
Right.
Obviously, they don't have a lot of resources, but they need to be a part, and I want to just add to what's been discussed here. There is a humanitarian crisis that must be addressed, but we've been here before, and we keep coming back, and we'll keep coming back until we address the underlying issues. And that's where, in part, the faith community comes in, but also the educational system. When I was there in 2020, I met with the educational minister. We looked at the educational curriculum, which creates the division. We talk about the Islamic jihadism. That was filled in the educational material, dividing the country even more, creating the religious divide and hostility. We were hopeful, and in fact, the educational ministry was making steps to change the educational material. This may come as a surprise, but the UAE was the source of that material, because the UAE is probably one of the best actors that we can work with in that region. They're very reasonable on many things. Their educational material, much better than what we've seen coming out of Saudi Arabia historically. So we've got to look at this holistically. Yes, let's fight the fire. Let's put the fire out. But let's make sure as we rebuild, we're rebuilding on a solid foundation. That includes the civil society and education, but that must include the religious community being a part of developing a way forward. I do think they can be a part of the current situation, but they have to be a part of the civil-led government going forward.
Okay. Before we close, anyone else want to make any final comments? Nicole, your point about food as a weapon. I remember when Mengistu in Ethiopia was using food as a weapon, and many of us raised our voices from the highest. I went to the UN, met with their ambassador, and he pretty much told me, go jump in the lake. And they used it effectively. I mean it was just, it was horrible. And now we're seeing a repeat of that as well. But anything else before we close?
I would just, to that point of the food being used as a weapon, it's because of the underlying instability that remains in that country. Yeah. And until we deal with the underlying instability, food will always be used as a weapon because it'll be in short supply.
Well, thank you so very, very much for your testimony and for your patience with the intervening votes. I do apologize for that, but I thank you. We will take what you have conveyed to the committee, and both Ms. Jacobs and I will work very hard to try to do more with the executive branch and to do what we can do in terms of resourcing as well on our side. So thank you. I just want to, again, thank the witnesses. The members of the subcommittee have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to the committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.